Great. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm really excited about this event. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm a professor of practice here at the School of International Public Affairs, and I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy. And it's hard to imagine we've been about 7 years now into building the Center on Global Energy Policy here at Columbia. Our inaugural fellow, when we were starting this center from scratch, when you're building a new center, your idea is, how can I get the world's most prominent experts to join something that barely exists yet and help build an exciting new research institute? Oh, that's sad. And was really fortunate about 6 months into joining the CEPA faculty and starting the Center on Global Energy Policy that my colleague from Brookings and from the Obama administration, David Sandalow, left a very senior job at the US Department of Energy to join Columbia, to join CEPA, and to, in partnership with me and many others, build the Center on Global Energy Policy. And he has worked in a broad range of issues across the board in domestic and international policy, with a particular focus here at Columbia and at the Center on Global Energy Policy on what's happening in China, which for all of us who study climate change and the energy sector, there is not a more important country. It's one that I think is really hard to understand. I feel like as a consumer of this and someone who pays pretty close attention to it, you pick up the newspaper every day and either China's leading the way in electric vehicles and renewables and low carbon energy, or it's building half the world's coal plants through its Belt and Road Initiative, or domestically continuing to expand its use of coal. So trying to find good information that helps me and all of us understand what is actually happening in China. And if you don't understand what's happening in China, you can't understand where the world is headed in terms of climate, in terms of demand for all forms of energy, is critically important. And that's why this book, this guide to Chinese climate policy, is such an invaluable resource. At the Energy Center, we are incredibly excited about this project for a couple of reasons. First, as I said, the book is just a vital tool for understanding what's happening around the planet. Climate change poses an existential threat. We are headed in the wrong direction. Emissions rose last year at their fastest rate since 2013, despite all the progress in clean energy around the world. China is by far the world's largest emitter, and as David often says, there's no solution to climate change that doesn't include China. Second, the guide is a resource for, as I said a minute ago, for anyone who wants to understand what's happening in China's energy sector. It's deeply researched with 20 chapters and 611 footnotes. The breadth of what's covered in here is really striking. Coal, renewables, nuclear, natural gas, forestry, vehicles and transportation, international climate negotiations, the history of climate policy in China. It's a really fascinating read. And it is comprehensively updated every year, which makes it a living, breathing document because things on the ground are changing so quickly. It also includes new material, including a new chapter on China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is enormously consequential, often discussed, but not always with a lot of depth and analysis, which this really provides. And then third, we're using at the Energy Center an innovative combination of dissemination tools to make this research broadly available to any who are interested. You can buy it on Amazon. You can download it for free from our website, energypolicy.columbia.edu. And there's a special section of the website devoted to this guide, and you can visit that part of the website on the Guide to Chinese Climate Policy. This is all consistent with the mission of what we do at the Center on Global Energy Policy every day, which is the highest quality research produced in formats and in timeframes that are useful and accessible to people outside of academia who are making policy or otherwise are leaders in the global energy sector. And so I'm really excited about this combination of channels, the use of multimedia tools, and innovative digital tools to make the extraordinary content in what David has produced available. So I hope people consume it in all these different forms. Thank you for making time to be with us today. We have a great panel to discuss what's in here after David presents the guide, and then he'll introduce those speakers and lead a panel discussion. So I just want to say thanks, David, and congratulations. And please join me in welcoming David Sandalow.
Thank you. Thanks a million, Jason. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for many, many years of friendship. Jason and I have had good times together, in the White House, in Beijing, biking in Central Park, and much more. So it's really fun to travel the path together. And it's remarkable what Jason has built at the Center on Global Energy Policy. I'm really honored to be part of it. I'm excited to be releasing this guide today. It consumed my summer, so I'm really happy for more than a few reasons that it's done. That this edition is done. It's really a team effort, something like this. It involves lots of different people, so it involves leadership from Jason putting a team together like this, leadership from Dean Janow at the School of International Public Affairs, who's really been extraordinary leader on our China work here in Columbia University. And then a group of us working at the center. I see Sally Chiu, who's just helped organize the research on this and done an amazing job. A number of research assistants of mine who I think are here, Robert Winton and Leo Liu and Weiping Wu and others. And then our team beyond this at the Center on Global Energy Policy, Artilia Gilliard, Anna Gossett, and others. So thanks to everybody who really made a difference here. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes about what's in the guide. Then we have three really tremendous speakers who are going to talk for about 5 or 10 minutes each about what's going on topics related to climate change in China. And then I'll introduce each of them right before they get up, and then we'll have a panel discussion and bring all of you in, because I know I see some faces I recognize in the audience that have a lot of expertise in this topic. So let's see if I can hit the right button here. What do you know? So this is the cover of the book. And here's the table of contents, which I think many of you have in front of you in paper. Jason just went through some of the topics, but 20 chapters start with background, then cover domestic policies, then cover foreign policies. It's detailed. I wouldn't call it comprehensive. There's still chapters I aspire to write that I haven't had the chance to write yet. But it covers a fair amount of information about China and climate policy and related topics. So I'm just going to hit on some points to level set and frame. And I see my colleague Artilia is walking in right after I thanked her. So thank you, Artilia, for all you did to make this happen. So just to start with the basics. China has more emissions of heat-trapping gases than any other country in the world. It leads the world. It has more than the US and Europe combined. This is 2018 emissions of CO2 from fossil fuels. 28% according to BP data, and other data is roughly similar. But of course, annual emissions are only one way of measuring contributions to global warming. Another way is cumulative emissions over time, because CO2 stays in the atmosphere for a long time once it's emitted, so this is a pretty common metric, looking at cumulative emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And the data here is a little bit less robust, but best data I found is that about 13% of cumulative emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution are from China, about half of what the United States has emitted over time. Another metric that's often used is per capita emissions. And on a per capita basis, China's emissions are roughly half those of the United States, actually less than half those of the United States. But one striking fact, China's per capita emissions are actually greater than per capita emissions in Europe today. That was not true for most of the last several decades. It just happened the past couple of years. GDP per capita in Europe is higher, but emissions per capita in China are higher. So the book contains lots of additional information on emissions. One thing I did is pull together all the different sources on Chinese emissions that I could find. The Chinese government provides this information with about a 4-year time lag, but it provides lots of other information that entities outside of China use to develop annual estimates, sometimes even biannual or semi-annual estimates. And I hadn't seen them pulled together like this before, so we pulled them all together and provide sources. And if others know of good sources, I'm eager to know about them. So China is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change. And I've got a few slides that illustrate this. And actually, I'll just start with a couple of slides about Shanghai. And I sometimes start speeches with these two slides. So this is a picture of Shanghai back in 1983, which is around the time I first visited, just to date myself. I actually was had the privilege of being in one of the first groups of exchange students from the United States to go over to China after normalization of relations. I studied at Huadongshi Fandashui in Shanghai. And this is what the Shanghai waterfront looked like back then. And this is what it looked like 30 years later. So in 30 years, the city went from this to this. By the way, that takes a lot of energy. And during that period, during the 10 or 12 years right before this, Chinese GDP tripled, as did Chinese coal consumption. Actually, this picture was taken about 2010. For those of you who know Shanghai, this picture is out of date. The Shanghai Tower is now at the right of that tall skyscraper there, the biggest building in Asia. So I'd love to find a new version of this picture that, taken with the Shanghai Tower in it. But so that's more or less what Shanghai looks like today. Here's a projection of what Shanghai would look like after 2 degrees centigrade of global warming, which is 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit for those of you born in the United States of America. And just to be clear, I think most experts in the world today believe that we are unlikely to avoid 2 degrees C or 3.6 degrees F of global warming. And this is projected sea level rise in Shanghai with that amount of warming. And this is projected rise at 4 degrees C, which is 7.2 degrees F. So the amount of adaptation that's going to be needed in China just from sea level rise is extraordinary. The eastern seaboard of China is one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. 550 million people live along the sea, in coastal provinces in China. Huge amounts of vulnerability to China from that, but also to storms and other types of disruptions from climate change. The warmest temperature ever in China, 50 degrees C, was experienced about 2 years ago in Xinjiang province, over 122 degrees Fahrenheit. So we have a lot of energy data in this. Just run through some statistics quickly. China uses more coal than the rest of the world combined. Last year, 50.5% of the world's coal. Chinese coal consumption peaked in 2013, went down for a few years. It ticked back up last year. It was declining for a number of reasons. There was a cyclical downturn in some energy-intensive industries. There's a structural change in the Chinese economy going from manufacturing to services. Clean energy sources are coming on and replacing coal. And then last year, so that cyclical downturn ended. There was resurgence. And then last year, there were a lot of hot days and cold days in China, which increased energy consumption. China's had major hydropower development for decades, both for flood control and for power. The biggest dam in the world is in China, the Three Gorges Dam, which is about 18 gigawatts. Hydropower is a clean energy source. Unless you're flooding vegetation, it doesn't really create emissions. China still has undeveloped hydropower capacity, unlike the United States, which really doesn't. And last year, there were 8 gigawatts of hydropower built in China. I have maps in the book of China's wind power and solar power resources, and here's a graph that shows the growth of renewable energy sources in China in the past 10 years. China leads the world in wind power development, leads the world in solar power development. Last year, about 45% of the solar added in the world was in China. And China's led the world in solar power manufacturing for more than the last decade. Major natural gas build going on in China right now, mainly to address local air pollution issues up in the north. In the north of China, vast network of coal for heating. China has relatively undeveloped natural gas resources in comparison to some other countries. It's about 7.5% of China's primary energy use. The global average is about 24%. So there's a lot of room for growth, and a lot of that's happening. We can talk about that more in Q&A, and there's more of this in the book. Last year, there were 9 nuclear plants opened in the world. 7 of them were in China. And there's been another nuclear plant opened since then. So I've read one commentary that it looks like now the future of the global nuclear industry is happening in China. And of course, that's a low carbon energy source. And to a first order of approximation, every nuclear power plant in China replaces a coal plant and avoids greenhouse gas emissions, although it creates other risks. Go right through there. Last year, China, more electric vehicles were sold in China than in the rest of the world combined. This chart actually shows the stock of electric vehicles. About 45% of the electric vehicles in the world today are in China. 99% of the electric buses in the world today are in China. We had a wonderful session in this room yesterday, actually, talking about the electrification of New York City's bus fleet. So New York City today has 10 electric buses on the roads. And the goal is to transition the fleet of 5,700 by the year 2040. Okay? China's 500,000 on the road, which they've added in the past 5 years. This is a really important topic. I'm excited. We have a couple of panelists speaking who know a lot about this, the urbanization of China. So Professor Wu can correct me if any of these statistics are wrong, but 500 million Chinese have moved from the countryside to the cities in the past several decades. It's been described as the largest migration in human history. Very significant consequences for climate change. The process of urbanization involves lots of concrete, lots of steel, and then urban residents tend to emit more greenhouse gases than rural residents. I read one statistic that in China there was more cement consumed between the years 2010 and 2012 than in the United States during the entire 20th century. So it's pretty extraordinary. Forest cover in China is bigger than a lot of people realize. About 22% of China is covered by forests. I think a lot of people who travel to Beijing and Shanghai and don't see forests. I had the experience a couple of years ago. I flew out of Xiamen, which is down in the southeastern part of China, and for 45 minutes flying out of Xiamen, it was forest, which I found astounding. I didn't realize how much forest cover there is, which you can see down there. And the Chinese government has very ambitious forestry programs, which it integrates into its global warming and climate change plans. And then the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's foreign policy framework, is extremely important from a climate change standpoint. Enormous amounts of capital are going into the development of infrastructure under the Belt and Road Initiative, and I spent a lot of time this summer trying to dig up all of the available sources on this topic. And what I found is the vast majority of these resources are going into high carbon assets, not into low carbon assets. Huge amount going to coal plant build, a small amount going into solar build and renewables, but almost all of it is going into high carbon development. So let me just quickly run you through my top line conclusions in the book. And the first one is that the Chinese government is taking significant steps to address climate change. And they include cutting coal, deploying low carbon alternatives, improving energy efficiency, putting a price on carbon. I didn't mention that so far, but the Chinese government has an emissions trading program, which is being implemented slowly. Adopting many other policies, peaking emissions by 2030, which is their big goal, and then speaking publicly on climate change. And one important point, there are no climate deniers in the Chinese government that we know of, and certainly none that have any observable influence in policy. The Chinese, in fact, I had a number of Chinese friends and colleagues who, in the kind of 2016 era, at some level expressed skepticism that the United States was really run by somebody, or was going to be run by people who didn't believe in climate change. It just didn't compute, I think. President Xi Jinping has spoken repeatedly about the need to address climate change, and China's a top-down governance system, and that kind of filters through the system. Now, it's an important point. Many Chinese climate policies have multiple objectives. There are some that are adopted simply for climate change reasons, but many are adopted also to address local air pollution issues, or also to address industrial policy reasons. And in many ways, I think that's a strength from the standpoint of climate mitigation. When you've got multiple policy objectives, that makes a policy more durable. Chinese governance systems have strengths and weaknesses when it comes to addressing climate change. And the strength that I think is most striking is the Chinese government's capacity for long-term planning. And it's just so different than what I'm used to in the United States. China's on its 13th five-year plan right now. It's planning its 14th five-year plan. The Chinese government has really long-term goals. It has two centenary goals. One of them is a 2049 goal. which is to have a prosperous middle-class society by the year 2049. And it influences policymaking. And here in the United States, when we pass a one-year appropriations bill, it makes headlines, right? It's like really a different framework than the planning that goes on in China. And when it comes to long-term energy transitions, that type of capacity for long-term planning, I think, makes a big difference. China also has some significant weaknesses when it comes to addressing climate change. One of them is the promotion system for local and provincial officials, which tends to focus on increases in GDP. And there has been some move towards environmental quality being a factor in promotions, but overwhelmingly, certainly historically and still currently, the most important factor is GDP growth, and that can often be an issue when it comes to trying to control local air pollution or control climate change. Enforcement systems are not as well developed in China as they are in the United States, and corruption is often an issue. And the statistical system isn't nearly as well developed as in many industrialized countries. There's been enormous progress in Chinese statistics in the past decade, and in many ways, China's statistical systems are quite professional. But there are still some systematic reporting biases that affect Chinese statistical systems, which can make it a challenge in understanding this issue. Importantly, some Chinese policies run counter to climate change goals. Last year, 30 gigawatts of new coal plant capacity was brought online in China. That's about 60 mid-sized coal plants. That's true even as China has goals to cut back on coal consumption, but the fact that there's all this new capacity that's being built is going to make it harder to cut back on coal consumption. Synthetic natural gas is and coal to chemicals more broadly is an area that produces a lot of emissions. And then a big issue is Chinese support for overseas coal-fired power plants. No country in the world is financing more than China when it comes to overseas coal-fired power plants. And that's locking in emissions in many places that are going to be there for many, many years. So really big impact, a negative impact on the global climate. And my final conclusion is China, like all major emitters, is going to need to do more when it comes to climate change. And this is particularly timely with the UN Climate Summit coming up next week. We are nowhere near where we need to be in addressing the challenge of climate change. The Paris climate goals are a big step forward, but they're not nearly enough. Many countries are not even reaching the Paris climate goals that they've set. Those commitments only go out to 2030. We're just not on a path to be addressing this problem. So, and China is the world's largest emitter, has the tremendous capacity to do more, and just like all the major emitters is going to need to do more for us to come to grips with this problem. So hopefully that rushed tour leaves you wanting more. And if it leaves you wanting more, here's how you can find out more about Chinese climate policy. First, you can go to Amazon, where this is priced at the lowest possible level. No money is being made off this. We're just covering Amazon printing costs, and you can order it on Amazon. Second, you can download it for free. You go to our website, the Guide to China's Climate Policy website, and all of this content is up on our website. And when you're there, you can also download the PDF if you want to download 160 pages. And you can also download it from our site at the Center on Global Energy Policy. So that's the Guide to China's Climate Policy. Thank you very much. So now we've got three really tremendous first-rate speakers who are just going to comment on Chinese climate policy. Then we're going to have a panel discussion and bring all of you in. And first, it's really fun for me to introduce my friend Debbie Seligsohn, who is an assistant professor of political science at Villanova University. Her work focuses on Chinese politics, Chinese environmental politics in particular, and U.S.-China relations. We first met when Debbie was at the U.S. State Department, where she worked for 20 years, including 4 years in Beijing, where she really made a difference on environmental issues. Debbie, thanks for joining us.
He doesn't remember, but we actually first met in Guilin when we were preparing for President Clinton's 1998 trip. And with the flooding, there were literally people rowing boats down the street in front of our hotel, and we had no idea if the trip was ever going to actually happen. And we had to keep replanning every day as the water level changed. So I was really pleased when you started with the pictures of Shanghai underwater, because that's already an increasing reality in China, just like it is in places like South Florida. And the impacts have definitely become more and more visible over the years. I was surprised that you said this wasn't a comprehensive volume. I thought that this volume was quite comprehensive. I think it's excellent. And I wish when I'd worked at the World Resources Institute and people said to me, is there a one-stop shop where I can find everything I need to know about climate change in China? I wish I'd had this book already. So I definitely recommend it to everybody who wants to look for that one place to find everything. And I'm curious what the missing chapters are. I think we need to ask David in Q&A. So I just had a few thoughts, both having read the book over the last couple of days. And the first is about air pollution, because I've been working, most of my recent research has been on industrial air pollution, where China has done a tremendous job. Chinese air pollution actually peaked in 2011 and has been declining ever since. So that's a little bit of bumps up and down along the way, but overall a really good trend downward. And the reality is most of that mitigation has not had any climate benefit at all. That, you know, when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions reductions, until this most recent wave of certainly global youth effort and the Sunrise Movement, we're starting to talk about we have to cut 50% and all this kind of things. We've been talking about cutting 5%, 10%, 15%. With urban air pollution, we need to cut 95%. And so most of that is by using pollution abatement equipment. And what has really reduced air pollution over the last decade has been mainly the effort to reduce air pollution in the power sector. Tremendous effort to put scrubbers and SCRs and better particulate removal, all these chemicals being removed. It uses more energy, not less. Now, Chinese power plants at the same time have become more and more efficient. So when I first started talking to people in China about this 20 years ago, all of that extra equipment would use 5% of the energy of a power plant. It's now down to 1.5% of the energy of a power plant. And that's because these power plants are so much more efficient than they used to be, which is great for greenhouse gases. It's also worth remembering in terms of this question of new power plants online. They're bringing new ones online. They're also shutting old ones. As David rightly points out in the book, one of the problems is they're running most of these power plants at half capacity right now, which is terrible. It's particularly terrible for the pollution abatement. It doesn't work as well when they're not running at full capacity. So there are a lot of political issues, which is why we always have to focus on the politics as well as the policy, because every locality wants their own facilities and things like that. But there are significant improvements. The other area where there have been a lot of improvements up to now is cleaner vehicles. And Chinese vehicles today are much, much cleaner than they used to be, and that's been moving very rapidly. So those are two areas of progress. And the Chinese have used the European standards for vehicle and fuel quality, which actually incorporate both greenhouse gas standards and air pollution standards in the same set of standards. So as the Chinese now move to Euro 5 and Euro 6 standards, although they call them China 5 and China 6, and actually by the time you get to China 5 and China 6, they're like Euro plus, because they add some things that we use in California, so it's really good. It is good for both, but I think it is worth remembering that air pollution is the most salient issue for the Chinese public. It's the visible problem, and it's been a real shift around sometime after 2010. The Environment Ministry was always focused on air pollution, but a lot of other parts of the government were definitely more focused on climate change up till then, because it was about energy policy. And as they started to realize how important this urban air pollution issue is, I think you've seen more parts of the government saying quite forthrightly that they prioritize urban air pollution. Other things I wanted to point out that I thought were really good is there's a lot of discussion in the book on standards, and I think this is really important because the truth is China's reductions have come and will come from standards more than that price on carbon. That, as you note in the book, the amount of trading that actually happens with emissions trading is really low. It just isn't the way Chinese organizations are kind of set up, and it doesn't work they're pretty sure that next year's reductions are going to be even more than this year's, and they aren't sure, so they want to hold on to those credits. They don't want to sell them, and that makes it very difficult to make a market. The other point I wanted to make about promotion precepts is in recent years, those environment promotion precepts have been really important to a lot of officials, and you actually hear it from people. But it's also the case that when you read the political science literature rather than the policy literature, that how important those GDP targets are is actually a matter of a great deal of debate. That actually taking care of your higher up guy in your faction and all kinds of other things that have to do with power are really important, and it isn't just GDP. And the general view among political scientists in the Xi Jinping era is all these political concerns, including repressing dissent and things like that, have actually become more important, and the economy less. So that's not actually where the trade-offs probably are. And finally, I wanted to say, I think one of the big things about the Chinese approach has been that it's been a very positive approach on climate change. It's all been about opportunity. We have these incredible opportunities: wind, solar, nuclear, hydro. Even things like carbon capture and storage. The Chinese have been doing most of the research on this, and whenever there really is a tough global agreement, they're going to be selling these sets all over the world. And so there's been this focus on opportunity, and there's also a lot of writing in the political science literature by people like David Victor and Meckling saying that you need that focus on opportunity and positive partnerships to actually create change and climate change. And I think that's where actually the Green New Deal comes in, because it's a positive framing offered in the United States. And I think if we get to a point where we have that kind of positive framing, there's going to be an opportunity for much greater U.S.-China cooperation. Thank you.
Debbie, thank you for those fantastic comments. I have about 17 questions I'd like to ask, but I'm going to hold it until we actually get the panel. And yeah, we were working together to bring President Clinton to China in 1998, I guess it was. Yeah, 1998. I was a White House staffer at the time, and we had been working for months negotiating over a roundtable that President Clinton held with environmentalists in Guilin, and then this, my memory, correct me, is the incredible weather. I mean, there were huge storms that looked like it might stop the President of the United States from getting out to Guilin. And I remember talking to security officials, and he eventually went out and did this event. So it was pretty amazing. Professor Weiping Wu is a professor at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, and she's director of the Urban Planning Program there. She's written a great book called Chinese Cities, and other books as well. Is a really internationally renowned expert on Chinese urbanization, migration. Really thrilled that you could come. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. The last 2 days was a big education reading through the book, and it's a subject that I don't know a great deal about, so I'm going to focus on what I know about and see, whether we can discuss some of these issues and their implications for climate change progress. And I'm really quite impressed by what China has done, right? And then in your book, you outlined that. A couple of data points really caught my attention. You said in the urban sector or in cities, there is higher per capita climate impact than rural areas, right? This is interesting. Maybe my memory was old. In the past, we tend to say, urban, because of its density, the per capita ecological print actually is smaller than rural areas. But that is different from climate change. So I think that is really important. And then you also said a dozen cities, even more so than the others, right? The other cities in terms of climate change impact, and the wealthiest urban residents, even more so. So if you put that, So you mentioned the 500 million migrants who've gone to cities, or China has essentially progressed from a country that only about 20% of its residents were living in cities in 1980 to now roughly 56% of China's 0.6 billion, right? Yeah, population now live in cities. And we're looking at another 200 million of increase of urban population. And that includes both migration as well as what we call in situ urbanization. That is, places that used to be rural, very small, and grown to be more urban in their economic activities and lifestyle. And that's where I wanted to really ask David to shed more light and give us more insights, is that you also have a couple of other data points. And you mentioned in China, the transport sector only contributed to 8%, roughly, to climate change impacts. Whereas in the United States, that's about 22%. And that's where urbanization in China will contribute in terms of that closing in the gaps between US and China. That's how I see it, because much of the higher climate change impact of urban residents comes from consumption, transportation, and other sort of lifestyle patterns that they incur, in addition, of course, to the built environment being very different. And so that's also where I see that there hasn't been fundamental awakening in that sense. And you mentioned about the middle class growth. And so together with the rapid economic development, industrialization, wealth building, I'm not quite as optimistic as you are for the urban sector in terms of its climate change trajectory. And I am seeing more in terms of its expanding per capita impact from these consumption and transportation patterns. So one thing is we see, it's quite interesting, you mentioned in Europe, right? Urban is different. And you go to China, you always see large cars, and even although the car emission standards have improved, as Debbie was saying, but cars have gotten bigger and bigger. We all know bigger cars have problems. And cities have gotten bigger and bigger, which contributed to longer commuting times. What I'm talking about is land growth in cities versus population growth. So we know how many 100 millions of population growth in cities, the land growth between 2000 to 2010 in China, out of the 600 or so large cities, or we call prefecture level cities, more than 300 of them have seen higher rates of land growth in terms of urban land than population growth. And so that is very, very different from the rest of East Asia, where only a handful of cities in that period of time were seeing higher land growth rates. So Chinese cities are actually becoming less dense, quote unquote, by just land area. So that clearly will contribute to a number of transportation, consumption, and other patterns that will have climate change implications. So that's one. And the second is, I remember one time I was trying to walk from one metro station in Beijing, and I said, oh, it's only 20 address changes. So it's Chaoyang Menwai Dajie, number 1 to number 20. I said, I can walk that. It was 2 metro stations in between. It was like the blocks were so large that it's almost impossible to walk. So the Chinese cities are increasingly seeing more and more of these so-called super blocks where you can't really walk or bike quite easily, and where there's sort of enclosed communities within these super blocks. Not everywhere. There's been some retrofitting of some of the super blocks more recently. So since 2016, the building standards and city planning standards have been really improving drastically in different direction, right? So that is something that I think the urban question can come into play in a little bit more prominent place in the climate change. And then second, which I'm not entirely an expert at, and I wanted to get your insight on, is this unfunded mandate and the regional disparities in climate change and adaptation, which you also mentioned in the book, that we know China, despite the fact that it's a centralized political system, physically is hugely decentralized. You know, it's probably one of the most decentralized countries in terms of physical relations between central and local governments. So what you have is some cities and some provinces doing far better than other places. And obviously it's not surprising to see, you know, of course, the northern provinces and cities are going to have a higher climate change footprint because of weather and heating and coal, right? But I'm also quite interested in learning from you how some of these central mandates are implemented in different fashions across different regions, provinces, and given that the capacities and revenue capacities of these different cities and provinces are hugely different. I see totally different capacities in infrastructure building. I suspect climate change would be sort of along a similar line in that case. And this will probably also speak quite highly to the coastal cities and regions that will have more risks in sort of sea level rise and so on, and how those cities and regions can handle that. Last, certainly is not in my expertise area, but you talked about the how China goes out to the rest of the world, and it's you know, sort of the resource-driven activities. And I would like to also get your insight more on how climate change factors in other key policy rationales or calculations. So energy security in China is a very large priority, and I didn't see that much mentioned in the book in the sense of is it at all costs, and is it also driving why coal remains to be more than 90% of energy consumption, right? Because it brings in employment, there's this number of other implications. So what I would love to see is how energy, climate change, and other development priorities. You mentioned the GDP as the key incentive for local officials to move ahead. But I think also is, I was in a conversation with some, again, State Department officials in Beijing. We're talking about how what China practices domestically will have lots of implications to African countries or Belt Road countries where China puts in investment. And so it will, so that connection between its domestic practices and its international practices is something that will have huge implications for the rest of the world that I would love to see. So given that, so I'd love to hear your insights more.
Well, you had both a lot of insights and a lot of questions for me. I think I got a lot of them, so we'll get to these. But that was fascinating. I'm really excited that Peggy Liu is here. So Peggy lives in Shanghai. She is the founder and chair of Joint U.S.-China Collaboration on Clean Energy, which is a great acronym that comes out to JUCCCE. She's the founder and chair of JUCCCE, which is a leading catalyst for green China and green energy in China. Peggy's been involved in a lot of really innovative projects promoting green China over the years. One that I think is really exciting right now is on healthy food. It's called Food Heroes, right? Her Food Heroes program, which is both promoting healthy eating in China and sustainable diets from an environmental standpoint in China. She's a graduate of MIT in electrical engineering and computer science, and really thrilled that you could be here. Thanks, Peggy.
Thank you so much. 大家好. Hello. You're supposed to say 好. Answer in Chinese. Hello, VJ. How are you? You know, this is such deja vu because I remember, was it a decade ago that, that you asked me to be an advisor to the Clinton Global Initiative for your energy and environment track. And I remember speaking, and I remember highlighting your book, Freedom from Oil, and the State Grid had given me specifically to present to you the Chinese translation of your book. And just to give you some context, in 2007, I was asked to start this joint US-China collaboration on clean energy NGO to help with programmatic collaboration between the two countries. And one of the first things that we were asked to do, this is during the Bush administration, was to help bring this concept called smart grid into China. And nobody knew what smart grid was at the time. We had this, I developed this white paper, we translated it, it had lots of pictures of what we thought smart grid was. It had a little electric vehicle picture. And I remember very, very clearly that the state grid people said, what is this electric vehicle picture? It seems like you should come back in 10 years. Of course, this was 2007. And so what was interesting is that by 2009, halfway through, the state grid announced $7.2 billion US to implement smart grid across the country by 2020. And for those of you who have been watching, there's over 500 smart city pilots now. And so for me, what is really interesting is this intention, this willpower of the Chinese government to take the best practices from everywhere in the world and say what works for China. And then if it works for China, let's put money. You know, they hired immediately 100 people to work on this thing called smart grid. So they put people behind it, and they think really big and long term. So for me, the intention is very evident that they want to solve this climate crisis. You know, in 2007, again, the year that we started JUCCCE, they came out with the first national climate policy plan. So all of this stuff, but in Chinese. And it very clearly said, we believe that climate change is person-caused, human-caused, and that China has to do its part to solve it. So one of the things that I do now is I go all around the world and I talk to people, whether it's prime ministers or CEOs or bankers, mayors, and I tell them this story of the greening of China, since I've been so sort of, you know, I've been sort of at the heart of the greening of China since then. And the first thing that people say is, wow, I had no idea. I had no idea that China was going green. Like literally, they're like flabbergasted. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this around the world with me, and I'm gonna say, look, this guy, he used to be the assistant secretary at the DOE, that, you know, he knows his stuff. He's been going to China. He started the Clean Energy Ministerial, and he says that China has been really leading the green revolution around the world. Don't just listen to me and, you know, watch my, you know, slides and everything. This is it at Columbia. There's facts. So one is, I've been super impressed. So just to give you some context, I'm an American. I was born in Michigan. You know, I studied here, and then I moved to China in 2004. I sort of accidentally became the head of this organization, and so for me, it's been a real roller coaster emotionally, right? Because initially, the Chinese and the U.S. government said this is the only place that we can work together in a non-political way. We want to do it, you know. And there was all this support until about 2010. And now, of course, we're in this very, you know, I don't know, as a Chinese American, it breaks my heart in two to see that these two countries that should be working together are you know, playing in this zero-sum game, frankly. So for me, it's really, it gives me so much optimism to see that all of these climate change policies have just been implemented so rapidly in China. And the progress that they have made is just unbelievable, right? So one is intention. The other thing that I see is innovation is coming out regionally, and it's unbelievable, right? People don't believe it when I said, look, this 15-year-old girl gave this speech at the UN and said, wouldn't it be great to involve teenagers in renewable energy by creating panda-shaped solar farms? And now there's a $1 billion fund by, I think it's Panda Energy Company and a Chinese bank. They've already built 2 of these. No kidding. And they're going to build 100 of these across China. Amazing that you can do that in China. Food is a really, I would love to see a whole chapter on agriculture and food here. You know, I'm on the board of something called Drawdown. If you haven't heard of it, please buy the book. And it's the first time scientists have come together to take a look at commercially viable solutions and rank them. And they say that basically these 80 commercially viable solutions, if we were to implement them around the world, would actually reverse climate change, not just mitigate climate change. But you know what the number 3 solution is? It's reducing food waste. And the number 4 solution is a plant-rich diet. And that's why I'm glad Marco Borges, my friend here, who got Jay-Z and Beyonce to go vegan, is here and supporting, you know, he knows that diet is tied to planetary health. Personal health is planetary health. So that's why I'm working on food right now. So these types of innovations are really important. So if you take a look at, there's this professor that's been working for, I think 40 years developing a salty water rice variety, right? And now China is giving it to places like Dubai and places in Africa, and rice is a huge source of methane, right? So all these regional innovations are really cool. They're coming from China. China is giving them away. They're actively collaborating with countries all over the world. So I'm really looking to China for innovation when it comes to climate change policy and innovation and action. The third one is, I think, inspiration is really important. So notice the 3 I's. One of the projects that we worked on at JUCCCE, when I realized that it's not enough to bring in smart grid into China, it's not enough to teach 1,000 mayors how to build eco-cities across China. It's not enough to switch the lighting from incandescents to energy-efficient lighting. This is all infrastructure. But sustainability is a formula. It's a balance between supply and demand. So we have to start thinking about how to get consumers to live a more sustainable lifestyle as well. So we started to construct this conversation of what if personal prosperity was by default green? And this led to the China Dream vision and the national identity. I took a friend from New Zealand recently on a walk around my block, and I would show you pictures. It's all under construction, but every single one of the ads and the billboards downstairs in the subway are all China Dream, and all the imagery is around nature and harmony with nature. It's around service to each other and, you know, harmonious lifestyle. What China has done is capture the fact that prosperity has to be, by default, sustainable. And they inspire people not just through policy, but at every level of society. So in Shanghai, where I live, on July 1st, we just launched a recycling program for waste. And I think it's like 46 cities will follow by 2020, this recycling pilot. And so, you know, it's interesting, when they do these things, it's not just announcing a policy, a regulation, but they have game show hosts, like whole 1.5-hour episodes with celebrities and, you know, game shows. And, you know, they bring Shanghai Media Group and WeWork and JUCCCE came up with a whole bunch of really fun games to get the citizens interested in recycling. And you make these IEs, right, the elderly who are helping you sort your recycling, they make them into the heroes on these game shows. They're the celebrities. So for me, what China is doing really well is intention, innovation, and inspiration. So the rest I'll leave to the panel, but I really, I'm going to, I just spoke with, speaking of BRI, just one last note. I just spoke with Christiana Figueres in Amsterdam, and one of the things that we talked about was her concern about the BRI not being green enough. And then I pointed out that at the last BRI summit, actually there's a lot of green initiatives that came out of China, which I think just need to be highlighted a little bit. But I'm going to speak with her again next week in DC at the American Energy Engineers Global Summit, and I'm going to actually tell her about this and tell her to read The Guide to the Chinese Climate Policy by Columbia University. So thank you.
We really really fascinating comments. Let me just, I have a few comments, and then I want to bring in some of you, make sure we have a chance to answer any questions that you've got. First, I should have mentioned in the beginning, we actually have a Chinese translation of this that's underway. We hope it's actually a big job, but we hope to have it done by next month and release a Chinese version of this next month. There are a lot of topics thrown out. I'm just going to start with one of the last ones that Peggy raised, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, just because it's so important from a climate change standpoint. I touched on this some in my remarks, but just to expand on this, and I talk about this in the book, and a few comments about this. First, the Chinese government has a set of policies called a Guidance to Promoting a Green Belt and Road, which is put out by 4 ministries. It's put out by Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Environmental, MEE now, Ministry of Ecology and Environment, NDRC, and Ministry of Commerce. And the first time I read this Guidance to Promoting a Green Belt and Road, I read it again. I thought, this looks like Greenpeace wrote it. I mean, the tone of this policy document, which is an official Chinese government policy document, is extremely green. If you had to place it on a US political spectrum, it would be like a liberal democratic type document. And so that's the aspiration of the Belt and Road. But this document has no enforcement mechanisms and not much in the way of implementation mechanisms. And so I spent a lot of this summer digging into what's actually happening under the Belt and Road. And what's actually happening in Belt and Road is very high carbon investment. There is, and I was at the Belt and Road Summit that Peggy mentioned, where there were some really exciting announcements that were made and some really important announcements about using the Belt and Road Initiative to promote low carbon lighting, efficient lighting, and energy efficient cooling, which, and particularly in the tropics where a lot of the Belt and Road investments are going in, energy efficient cooling can make a big difference. But the overwhelming majority of investments right now are going to high carbon assets, including coal plants. And so that's a very big issue. I want to ask a few questions and then we'll, did you have a comment? Please.
Yeah. So on the Belt and Road, it's what China offers, it's also what other countries want to buy. And so most countries have electricity regulators that won't allow companies to put additional things beyond what's required by regulation. So organizations like NRDC is doing work in Indonesia, looking at trying to do work in Pakistan, because if you don't change the regulations on the buyer end, it's very hard to make this transformation. And so I think a lot of people have been going into China, and I've heard some of these discussions saying, you know, you guys need to change your Belt and Road standards. It's probably not going to have a huge amount of influence unless people are taking a more creative sort of buyer and seller approach.
That's a really important point, and I'm glad you raised it. And it's kind of a broader frame on Chinese foreign policy in general has been a principle of non-interference with the internal activities of other countries, and this fits into that frame. China's not going to other countries and telling them what type of coal plants to build, but selling whatever types of coal plants they want to build. Yep. Quickly, Debbie, I was interested. Your comments on air pollution were really interesting. How much is the transition from coal to natural gas in northern China? How much of an impact is that on air pollution right now? Because you mentioned the scrubbers and all that type of equipment, but not that.
Well, since they haven't, I mean, coal went down 3%. So most of the abatement is by actually reducing the amount of pollution coming out of coal-fired power plants. It's not the natural gas transition. Okay. I mean, I guess that's cutting the increase, but it's not responsible for the decrease. So you have the power sector where regulations really started, the regs came in 2003, they started to be enforced in 2006. So we now actually have a long lead-in of, and then they increased again in 2011 and again in 2016. So, and they're now the toughest in the world by a significant margin. After power, they started focusing on diesel fuel because there was so much sulfur in the diesel fuel. That finally got dealt with in 2015. Then starting in 2012, they started focusing on other industries, cement and now steel, and sort of better regulations start to come in 2016 to 2018. Steel, again, now has the toughest regulations by a long shot in the world. That's really where the abatement is coming. What the natural gas is doing is sort of reducing the problem in these densest areas, you know, as opposed to sort of the sum total of pollution in the country and reducing the rate of increase. I mean, I think the big case to be made to other countries is the more you choose other options than coal now, the less abatement you're going to have to do in the future, right? India is now in the process of buying scrubbers for all its power plants, right? But India has, let me think. So China has over 4,000 coal-fired power plants, and India has about 400. So, you know, it would be very wise not to follow that same route, because ultimately you're going to want to abate it, right? But if you go for a wind power plant, you don't have to do that.
Weiping, I think I'll respond to some of your comments and questions on the per capita difference. And you made the comment that typically, at least in the United States, for example, there's higher per capita emissions out in rural areas, less than in urban, if I understood right, because urban is more dense, and there.
Right.
So New York City has some of the lowest per capita emissions in the country as a
Right.
result of that.
Yeah.
I think it's different in China because of the wealth disparity, right? Because urbanization is associated with increased wealth, and as a result of that, urban residents have higher per capita emissions. The process of urbanization itself creates emissions. But there was an interesting study this summer which finds that in China there's a peak, and that above a certain level of per capita GDP, emissions start to come down in cities, which is not surprising. It's kind of, there's a phenomenon called the Kuznets curve, which this is similar to, and so that's how I understand the urbanization process and global warming in China and emissions. And Peggy, so yeah, I think a couple of you asked, what are the chapters that I want to write? Then again, so the first one is absolutely on food and agriculture. And maybe you can help me write that in the next year. 'Cause
Absolutely.
I would love to,
30% of greenhouse gas emissions from food, so for sure.
yeah, no,
Yes.
it's and actually this is a hugely important issue, not just in China, but in the United States and around the world. I think there's been much too little attention
Yes.
to the greenhouse gas emissions associated with food consumption and how we can minimize that.
Yeah.
So I'm keen to work on that. The other one is on the coal to chemicals industry in China. And I do have a chapter on synthetic natural gas, but I want to broaden that out to look more at the whole coal
Well,
to
you know, what I'd
chemicals
love to
industry.
do is put you together with the drawdown folks, right? Because if you just look at the list, right, the number one is refrigerant management. And actually, if you look at the big chunks, what really surprised me, because I've worked in eco-cities, I've worked in clean energy, I've worked in transportation, and then I was like, whoa, the largest chunk is actually food and then land use. And then, of course, there's educating girls and family planning. It's like nothing to do with clean energy and clean, you know, low carbon transport and cities. So what's interesting is that I think people need to broaden their scope when they talk about climate change to all these other buckets,
Yep.
right? The other thing that I forgot to mention, which I would love to see, is the decoupling of GDP and energy use. So, you know, how did China do that? Maybe, I think, Sweden, right? Maybe California.
So, and the way I frame it in the book is that there's been a partial decoupling of GDP and emissions growth in China. So in the past 5 years, GDP in China has grown about 42% roughly, and emissions have grown 2 to 5%, depending on what data set you look at. So that's a pretty significant decoupling. You know, but on the other hand, you know, we've seen as GDP increase in the past year, emissions start to go back up. So I don't think you can say it's a complete decoupling. And I think the reasons that decoupling is happening are mainly two categories. One is a transition in the economy from heavy manufacturing to services, structural changes in the economy. And then second are government policies that are promoting clean energy and energy efficiency and help to reduce emissions.
Well, but particularly in heavy industry, right? I mean, the 1,000 Enterprises program. And, you know, I mean, Elizabeth Warren is now pointing out that most of the greenhouse gas emissions are produced by 100 companies in the United States, right? So what the Chinese did was focus on that, right? Was
Yes.
these major companies are where most of the greenhouse gas emissions were, and they pushed through these energy efficiency plans. It extremely top-down, and it was setting targets, setting quotas, and putting people's promotions based on them.
Can I also point out that's a really amazing program where the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab was really fundamentally, I think, driving a lot of the best practices, right? And so this is a great example of why countries should be working together, right, and not competing with each other. So there's so many things that the US and other countries did in terms of coming to China, realizing that they needed to help China, and then China was able to actually implement at scale. And that's a great example.
Thank you. Let me throw it open for any questions or comments, and I bet we have microphones somewhere, right? Yep, Caitlin, good. And for those who are listening on podcast, as some of you do, my name is David Sandalow. I'm here at the Center on Global Energy Policy. I'm here with Professor Debbie Seligsohn from Villanova University, Professor Weiping from Columbia University, Peggy Liu from Chairman of JUCCCE in Shanghai. And this is on the record, and please identify yourself and ask your question.
Hello, my name is Friederike Liebach. Thank you very much for the interesting introduction to the book and also the debate right now. You talked a lot about how China invests outside of China and influences the world by doing so. However, what you haven't touched upon yet is that China itself is actually quite restricted to their own companies. So European or US companies very often state that for them, China is not accessible, especially in the renewables field, for example. Do you think that China will change that policy and will open up more? And if so, will this help to go more towards a decarbonization, more towards renewables and climate policies? Thank you.
It's an important question. Does anyone want to answer that?
Well, I think you probably know more about it in renewables than I do. There's certainly been a lot of foreign companies in the renewables space in China over the years. The Chinese have been increasingly competitive and in some cases even bought some of the international companies, which is something that other companies do. In terms of power generation, there were actually more foreign companies in China years ago than there are now. And they mostly came in with kind of quick and dirty power plants to meet massive shortfalls, and we're not actually building the larger, cleaner projects that then took over the market.
Maybe I'll just add really quickly. I think what you are seeing also is the effect of some of the capital control mechanism that's still in place in China. So generally, in some of the sectors, particularly in energy, you can either have equity investment into, with a local joint venture partner, or you do sort of what we call the PE, and then so the renewable energy sector and nuclear power plant, for instance, in Guangdong, it's a lot of PE investment, but it's the other
private equity.
Private equity, yeah, investment. It's not a full range of mechanisms that are available to foreign companies or capital. So that has a lot to do also with capital control, not just,
Yeah, RP.
Hi, my name is Ping Song from World Resource Institute. I'm a policy nerd, so I have one comment and one question. They're both very nerdy. So my comment is I'm very glad that your guy mentioned the non-CO2 greenhouse gases, which actually looks very small compared to carbon dioxide. But then, if you put them aside, it's actually the 7 largest emitters in the world. So China alone emit non-CO2 greenhouse gases larger than the total emission of Japan or Germany. So I'm really glad that you guys talk about that, but I think maybe it's a bit more elaboration about the future trends of non-CO2 as well as the mitigation potential. Because Deborah actually recently published a paper to estimate what China has been done in the last few years. Only compare 2015 and 2018, only 3 years. The new policy on non-CO2 actually cumulatively reduced emissions, by 2030, about 3 gigaton of CO2, actually 3.5 gigaton CO2 equivalent. So that's huge. But China can actually do more. So our research shows that, that another 3 gigaton CO2 equivalent reduction can be done, between 2020 and 2030. So that is a huge potential area that I think should worth more attention and a little bit more discussion. So my nerdy question for you is that we all know that, as you know, that the country needs to do more, and countries are encouraged to submit a new nationally determined contribution, or NDC, by 2030, and to do, to commit to more progressive and more ambitious targets. So, based on your understanding about the technical feasibility, ambitions, political will, economic situation, everything considered, as well as the international climate environment, what kind of target you think that China, if China say they're going to come out by next year, that they're going to do this, that from your point of view, of course, personal point of view, that you think is, you would say that's ambitious, that's worth another round of applause.
So thank you. So your first question is about non-CO2 gases. And just for those who aren't kind of climate nerds in the room, like you describe yourself as, so about 75%, roughly 3/4 of the warming of the atmosphere caused by humans is done by carbon dioxide. And then there's another 25%, a little bit less, that's done by methane is the second most important gas. Then there's some fluorinated gases that are really as a result of some industrial processes of refrigeration. And then some gases associated with ozone depletion that also have an impact. So I do have a section in the book on this. I tried to gather as much data as possible. The data on those non-CO2 gases are not nearly as good or as current as the data on CO2. But there's reasonably good data on Chinese methane emissions and practices that can be done to reduce those. One interesting point about in this area, there's been a lot of effort to manage the emissions of HFCs. In China, HFCs are a super pollutant. They have every molecule has thousands times the global warming potential of CO2. China's the world's biggest producer and consumer of HFCs, but has adopted some pretty stringent measures to cut back on those. There's been some scientific findings in the last year suggesting that there's illegal production of CFCs, another pollutant, super pollutant in China, and the Chinese government's trying to crack down on that. So that's underway. I think your second question was, what do I recommend for China's policies? I don't recommend a particular target to the Chinese government. That's something the Chinese government's going to decide for itself. And I don't feel that's my place, to state publicly what I think they should do. I'm here to try to document what is actually happening right now and provide a reliable, authoritative source of information to the extent I can on that topic.
I can actually give two answers to that.
Please.
I don't need to be so diplomatic. One is distributed energy, right? So that's an obvious one. We've been working on it, but a lot more can be done. The other one is the Arctic policy, right? So I think I'm very concerned about methane. So I would really like some this is for every country, not just China, but China is certainly one of the big players there. So those two would be my big.
And maybe I should just be clear when I give that answer. I mean, I do say, and it's my last conclusion of the book, China needs to do more. We all need to do more, but in terms of numbers and years and that type of thing, that's not what this is about. Yes, sir.
Gabriel Evgerinos, Energy Mentors and NYU. Thank you very much for an excellent discussion. My question is something that you touched a little bit, and we talked a lot about it yesterday, and that is carbon price. And to what extent can you see China with the 4 billion tons of coal or something like that they have, be willing and able to go ahead with a carbon price policy in the near term? I'm not talking about 2060, whether it's on a net zero basis or not. And the second question that I think is related to what we talked about for gas infusion is LNG as well as pipeline gas. Is it true that a lot more of the attention has gone not just for the greenhouse gas emissions, but also for the PM 2.5 problem of the particulates, which you can dilute, if you will, with putting more gas in the power mix of fuels, as well as, of course, replacing the northern provinces from coal heating to gas heating. And finally, one last question for you. What is the reaction of China for Beyond Meat and Impossible Burger?
Okay, there's a lot there. I'm very glad you asked about emissions trading, since it's an important topic and we haven't had a chance to talk about it so far. So let me just say a few words about China and putting a price on carbon, because there's actually a lot of activity in China right now on emissions trading for carbon dioxide. Whether it's going to be a significant factor in addressing climate change is an open question. But there is an enormous amount of activity underway on this. China, there have been pilot programs on CO2 emissions trading in China since 2013, 2014. There exists now in 8 different provinces and cities. The amount of trading that's gone on, there's been about $1 billion of CO2 emissions allocations that have been traded in Chinese markets, about $1 billion total. And actually, when President Xi Jinping was here at a summit with President Barack Obama a couple of years ago, he announced in a fairly high-profile way that China was moving forward with an emissions trading program. The Chinese government is currently in the process of developing the rules and regulations to do that in the power sector in China. And when fully implemented, if there's really an emissions trading program for the power sector in China, that would be, in terms of tons controlled, the largest in the world. There's some significant questions about how important this program is going to be, as I said, and there are at least two categories. One is whether the administrative mechanism can really be developed adequately in light of availability of data and other types of challenges, right, at Chinese facilities. And I think I'm interested if any of our panelists have any thoughts about this. And then the second is just the level of ambition. I mean, the Chinese government has not said what the cap is going to be, or there's going to be a cap, or how that would work. So there's some big details of the program that remain, but it's gearing up in a very significant way, and I think it's very important that the Chinese government is committed to a price on carbon.
So,
And nationally, yeah. Any thoughts?
So, yeah, I think it's never going to be a very important part of the story. I think a lot of the reason that the Chinese government has been interested in carbon trading is because they liked CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, and they saw carbon trading as a way to be able to do a bit more trading with the European market and things like that. Also, if you do cap and trade, it had been a revenue source for NDRC, whereas if you do a carbon tax, it's a revenue source for the Ministry of Finance. So a certain amount of it is just internal politics. But I think it's worth going back to when the United States looked like it was going to have a cap and trade program under Waxman-Markey, when I used to work for the World Resources Institute, and America's people calculated that 75% of the reductions under Waxman-Markey were not going to come from cap and trade, but were going to come from standards. So things like CAFE standards and renewable energy portfolio standards and building standards and all those things. Those are the things the Chinese are good at. They've been doing it now for quite a while. They get tougher and tougher every year. So the experience from the Chinese sulfur trading program, which precedes the carbon trading program, is you get cap, no trade. Because everybody is worried that next year, so in the US, because we have a very litigious society where the government puts everything out in the Federal Register many years in advance, the government can't suddenly change your cap next week. That's not true in China. So every power plant is worried that, yes, I could sell these credits this year, but I don't know if my cap's going to be dropped in half next year, so I'd rather hold on to the credits for myself. So when they did pilots in Jiangsu and somewhere else, they had like 4 trades, all of which were basically forced managed by the government, rather than because, oh, this power plant's failing and you have a bunch of credits, so why don't you sell them to them and you're going to do it, right? So I don't think they're ever going to do a lot of trading. I don't think it matters. And that's the key thing, that the Chinese government, that's where the Thousand Enterprise Program, that's where all of these pollution standards are important. That's where the fact that they have ever-increasing fuel efficiency standards for vehicles. That's where the fact that they have raised parking fees in big cities by so much that people are actually using public transportation much more than they were 5 years ago. All of these other things are really useful and much easier for the government to manage than the minute measurements that you would need. They have good equipment on every power plant in China, but you actually need much tighter measurement to do a good trading system, because slight error can be huge amounts of money in what is essentially a derivatives market. So that's the other problem, is you'd be creating, and all Chinese markets are vast casinos, right? I mean, that's what all Chinese people refer to the stock market as, right? So whether it would be the perfect control mechanism, I'm a little skeptical. People like it. It's certainly not doing any harm, but it's not where the big emphasis, not where the big savings are going to come from.
We got about 5 more minutes and way too many hands. Let me, back of the room, yes, and then here, and then we're going to close with a question for you. Let's take them all three together. And then we'll get final comments.
Last night in this room, there was a talk on carbon taxes. And it seems that for economists, a lot of the appeal was this is supposed to correct the distortion. It provides exactly the right price signal all the time. It seems that you're advocating for a lot of policies that aren't carbon taxes and could create some distortion, whether that's a big increase in the cost of parking or something else. Is that a concern, or in general, do you think that kind of collection of various policies is going to be the approach?
Let's hold that and then get second question right here in the middle, and then, yeah.
Hi, my name's Henry. I'm a random person, but appreciate this talk. My question is sort of about the U.S., like contrasting U.S. and China. I think when I think of the U.S., it's a lot of like climate denial, but sort of shadowy, just like industry influence, sort of like being a barrier to a lot of change happening. Is there like an analog to that in China? This is largely some ignorance on my part about the economic and political structure there, but like, is there a big coal? Like, is there, you know, an equivalent to that? And yeah.
That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah. Vijay Vaitheswaran, you have the last word.
Thank you. David, congratulations on the timely and much needed book. There was a lot of discussion about government policies, and China clearly, when it comes to energy and climate, has put a lot of thought into the planning and prospects for these areas. But one of the other dimensions of China that I saw, living in Shanghai for many years, not far from where Peggy lives, is the role of the dynamic private sector, particularly entrepreneurs. We saw that in social media with WeChat, with fintech innovation. We see it even in sectors where the government has a strong role, such as artificial intelligence or facial recognition. The ingenuity is driven by private sector entrepreneurs, often venture funded. Do you think there's the same prospect with energy innovation and dealing with climate challenges for that entrepreneurial talent and that ecosystem that has succeeded in other areas to also drive some of the solutions that policies are calling for? Or do you see this as a different sort of sector, one that's much more likely to be captured by state-owned enterprises, or maybe a different kind of state-directed capitalism might be what we end up seeing? Thank you.
I so wish we had an hour and not 4 minutes to answer these really important questions. But let's, and one of our brands here at the Center on Global Energy Policy is we try to end on time. So let's be really quick. I'm going to answer the carbon tax question, which is there is, right now there's a carbon emissions trading program in China. There's not a carbon tax underway. I don't see that a carbon tax coming in, partly for bureaucratic reasons. Any disagreement from the panelists on that?
Yeah, and I would just say I'm a political scientist, not an economist, and there are political costs as well as economic costs to things. And often what you can get is better than it's better to go with what you can get than the economist's ideal. And standards are easier to get through in both the United States and China.
Okay, really interesting question, I thought, about the influence of coal in business and industry in China, particularly for people who don't know anything about China. Do we have anything analogous in China happening, you know, right now to what's happening in the United States with fossil fuel lobbies kind of arguing against climate action? Any thoughts on that from
So
anyone?
that's kind of what my dissertation was about.
Well, please,
So,
then tell us
So
in
I
60
was like,
seconds.
oh, Henry, thank you. Basically, one of the things the Chinese government did that was enormously effective was break up the power sector into a bunch of competing companies in the early 2000s. And that's why they were able to get a handle on the power sector, and that's why they were able to go there first. And what I've seen as I look at these different sectors is when they introduce competition, so that these companies are all competing for permits, because you need permits to build new facilities, they're able to manipulate that to get some of the companies to try to say we're the green ones. Mm-hmm. In terms of the innovation, energy sector actually needs enormous, so the solar panel industry actually did start in the private sector, but for the most part, especially when you're talking about large power plants, you do need pretty large-scale companies. And the advantage in China is this long-term planning, which in significant part has come from the state sector. And the problem is, in general, from innovation to implementation in energy has been like a 50-year timeline if you go back and look at different innovations. And so the ability to kind of move these things through and try them. The Chinese have, like on nuclear, they have pebble bed demo reactors that are like 200 megawatts. That's not a small private entrepreneurial thing to try, right? And that's been the problem in the US. We have a lot of academics working on it, but we don't have that kind of investment in future technologies at pretty large scale.
Yeah, so I'm sorry that I need to close it off, particularly because I know Peggy has lots of wisdom on this topic, but she'll have to do it privately after this. But my short answer to your question is yes, absolutely. There's an enormous amount of innovation happening in China generally. That wasn't the case a decade or two ago, but there's been concerted effort by the Chinese government to improve the innovative capacity of Chinese industry, and right now, particularly in web-based, in mobile technologies, that type of thing, and in ways that extend out into energy, that's absolutely happening. And I'll close with a story, which is a student of mine here. Last year, came from China. She'd never been outside of China before. She'd been here for a week, and I asked her, what's your impression of New York after never having been outside of China? And her answer was, it is so weird. Like, everywhere I go, I need to carry cash or a credit card to pay for stuff. And she just wasn't used to that. And for an American, that's just remarkable that should seem so odd. But right now, mobile pay is omnipresent in China, and this is one example of the type of innovation that's happening there. Thank you so much, Debbie, Weiping, Peggy, for making the time to do this, all of you for coming. I really appreciate it. All the best.